Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning back into Let's Play Chroma Squad. I'm your host, the Ronin of Dreams, and on today's episode we're going to be taking a look at the strategic level of gameplay in addition to Season 1, Episode 2. Now, I said before that the studio level is a bit of a light spice of strategy, and I stand by that statement, because it's more than just re-gearing your characters and changing your skills for each episode. In fact, we have a little publicity system. Now, we can always check our fans and see how close we are to a game over, but there's also an email system in this game, and I find it pretty nice, actually. It adds a little bit of flavor by giving some tokusatsu references while providing opportunities for the player. Today's email comes from Henshin Justice Unlimited, which is a real-life website, and just by clicking a few buttons and responding, we get 10 free fans. Future emails are going to represent options for choices as well as plot development, so we'll see those as they come up, and in fact we have a choice at the end of this episode. The other elephant in the room is the crafting system. Now, it's simple yet complex, and I've got a lot to say about it, so here we go. The crafting system gives us new formulas to follow with every season, and we fill those formulas with the materials that drop from enemies or have gotten elsewhere, such as recycling, or by buying material packs. Now you can already see there's a lot of random elements here. Not only do you get random properties on your gear, but material packs are semi-random in the 5 items you get, and recycling is completely RNG based on whether you get anything from your materials. Now, I take a look over here to the squad menu to show off that the initial the initial equipment we have is all blank. They're placeholders that have no stat benefit whatsoever. And I've decided that for this playthrough, I'm going to be crafting boots and buying gloves. Kind of like the plus attack that come from the Tier 1 gloves in the shop. They're also fairly cheap, so I can go ahead and try and do 2 pieces of gear in one episode. The random properties are judged by a crafting rate number, and I'll talk about that and I will talk more about that in a second. But we also have an item drop rate modifier. Now, we already have one method of influencing that. Mr. Beaver, aka Shiny, has item drop rate modifier as part of his actor bonus, and will later get an upgrade in the studio to do the same thing. Meanwhile, we have the workbench available, and I'm choosing not to pick it up to show off why crafting rate matters. I will pick up the healthcare bronze upgrade, simply to have more HP, and we finally get access to a bigger studio, but it's pretty expensive right now. The other thing you can do in the studio is, at any time, change pretty much every phrase in the game. And right now I'm going to just giving the fail pile a little bit more of a nod of thanks in keeping with them for this first season. But I will open that up in Season 2, and we might actually have our squad change everything with each episode, just depending on how the thread participates. Now, I mentioned earlier recycling is very, very random, and because I'm going to have so many gloves and boots to recycle to try and finish out crafting the full set of boots, you'll see exactly why I dislike it. It's a little too RNG based. However, it's a way of using old gear when otherwise you have no means of reusing old gear, so I guess it's worthwhile to at least get something rather than nothing sometimes. The final item from recycling is always going to be random among the tier, so you'll see that change depending on how many of those we trigger throughout the game. And while I'm initially one short in cotton, thankfully recycling is kind to me. But I did mention crafting rate has something to do with the random properties, and we're about to see why. Crafting rate, we know, is supposed to manipulate what tiers of properties we can get. This is from dev responses to Steam question threads, but we're not exactly sure how. I'm demonstrating right here that the tiering is present. We have a 3% critical when the other boots we crafted were 5% critical, so there is some level of tiering involved, but there's a lot of unknowns about it, and a lot of random nature to the properties that we can get. You can get properties that do not appear in the store on gear more than maybe once, period, throughout an entire playthrough, but you could roll that theoretically on any piece of gear. Team attack percentage tends to be one of those as a good example. But we're going to go ahead and get into Episode 2. Now, you notice Vulcan's story is one of 3. We could technically jump around if we wanted to, but I prefer to play it straight for the purposes of the LP. Meanwhile, our plot for this episode is, well, paying homage to other Sentai shows in-universe. And there's some discussion of how they want to go about that. We also find out that Wangtron has family. Lots of family. Now, his sister wants to be kidnapped because, hey, they've always dreamed on being TV in that role. But, as some writers are concerned, the Chroma Squad crew does not want to fall into the wrong tropes or stereotypes. It's a little bit amusing that they're being that transparent about it in this episode, but at the same time, it's a real-life concern for some writers in some series. The low-budget nature makes them particularly vulnerable to this, so it's sensical, it's flavorful, and I kinda like it. What is more amusing right now, though, is apparently Wangtron's sister has to be at least part biological because, well, they're married and his brother-in-law is going to fill in instead. I leave the imagination of the Wangtron family tree to you. This episode also happens to be very, very short. We only have the one scene, as you might have been able to predict by the director's instructions. And you can see how some of the phrases we've picked in the studio option are starting to come up in discussion. Now, we don't get them all because there is a gimmick to this episode, and it's part of the reason why it's so short. They're about to reveal that after talking about team acrobatics. Oh, Mr. Beaver. Oh, what did you do, Shiny? Yep, still at the laundry. No transformations. So basically what we are is we're still in tutorial land. Now, the episode does bring something to us in the form of a new enemy type, and really, the new enemy type is not exactly a big roadblock, but it is representative of your tank among normal grunts. They are still melee only, and they do have a special trick up their sleeves in that they can stun player characters, which is really annoying when it happens, but unfortunately, they don't use that special skill in this episode. Really, this is going to be a beatdown, which is why I'm going to talk a bit more about crafting and the shop and how they balance. But Shell Shield, I mean, they do hurt, and they do have a defensive value that I'll talk more about in stats later. Probably next episode, in fact. But as we fly around and easily fill our audience bar by doing the director's instructions and the bare minimum of teamwork, I want to talk a bit more about the shop versus crafting. Crafting's strength is that you can get properties that won't appear on those pieces of gear in the shop, sometimes at all. Its weakness is how random it is, and really, even with having Mr. Beaver, the actor, as part of your cast, it's very unlikely that you'll get enough drops throughout the game to craft without spending a lot of your cash in materials packs. I'm not completely adverse to that because materials packs as a money sink is useful. Late game you will have quite a bit of money, except maybe on challenging difficulty if you've had a lot of fan and audience issues. But ultimately, money's not a big problem later on. Early, like it is now, we do have that problem, and it's rather annoying that it comes up. We've also already finished the director's instructions, so for this episode, you really don't have to worry about team attacks trying to bolster with team acrobatics. It's nice, but it shows we're still in tutorial land very clearly. The shop items, meanwhile, are stack. They're going to be the same every playthrough. Some of them are going to be valuable to you, some aren't. And ultimately, the shop is very precise to making sure you have a lot of HP available. That's both good and bad. I'm not too worried about it in a whole because it makes it so that gear is something you can complete the game in without touching crafting at all, aside from your mecha. But the downside of it still remains that it's kind of boring. Now, if you want characters to all look the same, they actually have the casual mode gameplay just to help enable that. Stats matter very little at that easy level of difficulty, so you're able to make your team look exactly the way you want them to. It's a nice touch, but for any real gameplay, you're going to wind up having your team be slightly mismatched in their visual representation when they transform. That said, this episode's ending rather quickly. We're going to set up a 4-man team attack because our assault, Mr. Fahrenheit, -1 move, being a little bit of a problem. We also randomly get the fast forward dialogue, which we're probably going to have a counter for that later, because it shows up a lot. Simple episode, a cut to a couple different episodes that have been done in actual Super Sentai shows, and basically some more flavor. Again, I really like the dialogue, and it shows how strong this game has been as a love letter to Super Sentai. But it's not audible, it's not vocalized, so we do what we can for reading it. Now, at the end screen, we do have a full audience bar. We got 7 materials. It's great. And we got a material we can't buy yet in paint, which is really useful. Now, normally I'll fade out here, but we do have the first option choice. We have an email that represents an opportunity. Either way, it's going to show a little bit of Super Sentai flavor, but we can enlarge our sword. So I'm going to leave it to the thread to choose whether we report this as spam, or we spend $117 on enlarging our sword. That said, I thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Let's Play Chroma Squad, and I hope to see you again shortly.